Well, this is something none of us expected. Two of last year's wildest stories have actually merged into the same story, and we've got a private equity firm to thank for it all. So here's our recent video on Kerbal Space Program 2. It absolutely exploded, and that makes sense. It's a crazy story. In short, the publisher, which is Take-Two, the Grand Theft Auto people, they ran a publishing label called Private Division. Private Division published Kerbal Space Program 2, and it was developed by an internal studio called The Intercept. But it was a total disaster. The early access for the game was a mess, and then legal disclosures in 2024 suggested that the developer was closed over the summer. Take-Two basically didn't admit that, and they only admitted it in public whenever they sold off Private Division stuff way later. And all the while the game was sitting there on Steam for $49.99, you could go and buy it in early access, even though we had no idea who would develop it. We had no idea if its publisher even existed, and who even owned that publisher. It was absolutely mad. But now I've got an answer to that question, and I've also got a twist. A private equity firm gobbled up the assets of Private Division, but not only Private Division. So here's the twist. An entirely different set of people who resigned en masse after falling out with their billionaire heiress owner are going to be running the whole thing now. This job is absolutely never boring, just like our sponsor, who keep me protected online. So here's the deal. Data brokers exist, they harvest our data any way that they can, and then they sell it. And that means we get robocalls, we get spam, and even worse, security vulnerabilities, especially the likes of social engineering. And when big corporate data leaks happen, as they often do, that data often ends up with the brokers. And that's where incogni.com/Bellular News is a superpower, and it is so simple. We've actually got the legal right to have our data taken down. But that takes hours, and there's nothing stopping that data from being recollected. So what Incogni does is it scans the brokers, it automatically sends takedown requests, it adds you to suppression lists, and best of all, it constantly rescans to keep your data down. So here's my Incogni dashboard. You can see 114 sent, 8 in progress, 106 completed, and I'm on 21 suppression lists. And that means those brokers will not recollect my info. Now you can add up to 3 emails and home addresses as well, and the upshot is simple. Your data not being spread around without your knowledge or your consent. And I've actually not had a single robocall since I started with them. Incogni means you can actually benefit from the laws that actually exist to protect you but are normally completely unusable. And you can get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/Bellular News. I cover the Kerbal and Private Division context in the intro, so here's the other side of the story. Annapurna Interactive. It's quite something. So Annapurna Interactive are the game division of Annapurna Pictures. Now, Annapurna Pictures is ran by Megan Ellison, and if Ellison rings a bell, that's because she is the daughter of the Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison, and one of her other siblings is also pretty damn big in the film industry. Now, Annapurna Games still exists, but it is a shell of its former self. Essentially what happened that we detailed in this video is a series of disagreements with key leadership that led to the whole staff quitting. Yes, they all just left, which is pretty crazy. And that leaves us then with 2 things. One, Private Division, which owns a whole bunch of games, including Kerbal Space Program 2. And thing number 2, the staff of Annapurna Interactive, who are experienced, well-regarded, and were pretty damn good at picking winning games. Things like, say, Stray, Outer Wilds, and Neon White. So, taking a look at these 2 things, you could certainly say that it's what we would call an opportunity. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier got the scoop in this. Citing sources familiar with the matter, he reported that Take-Two had sold Private Division's assets to Haveli Investments. Right, now Haveli Investments are a private equity firm based out of Texas, and they've got experience in enterprise software, but also video games. As an example, they own Jagex, who are the RuneScape developer. Now, of course, them buying the assets of Private Division is not a surprising thing, but they're an investment firm. They're not a game publishing company, and that's where the Annapurna stuff comes in. So Jason is reporting that Haveli struck a deal where the ex-Annapurna staff would basically form a new company, and that company would get the licenses and the contracts from Private Division. So essentially it's Haveli just setting up a new publisher, staffing it with experienced people who all quit their last job, and then finding a whole bunch of games and contracts to fling at it. But it's not perfectly good news, because whenever I said the assets of Private Division, I did actually mean that. Basically, before the acquisition, Take-Two utterly gutted Private Division, and now the remaining 20 or so staff have been told that they can explore their options. Which is kind of rough, but you do see the logic here. Private Division was not sold as like a company that you could just acquire and then start running. Take-Two had entirely gutted them because to Take-Two, and probably to the people they were pitching to, basically the value lay in the contract, the IP, the rights to things, not actually the team. This is absolutely shit for those people, especially the people that survived the massive layoff and basically are now on notice again. But in the big picture sense, this is far, far from the worst that could have happened here. And that's why the Annapurna angle actually matters. Because, see, with a publisher, right, it's not just having people sitting on computers sending emails to other people, also sitting on computers. Whenever you've got people working at a publisher, one of the most important things is the personal network of those staff, right? Who they know, what deals they've made. That is a key asset in the publishing business. And all of this begs the question, what the hell happens next? And what's going on with the games? It's absolutely fair to say the Private Division had a mixed run. Now, sure, you've got Outer Worlds. That was a really strong early hit for them. Then they had the next big shooter from a Halo man called Disintegration, which happened and then, well, disintegrated. Then there's 2023's Kerbal Space Program 2, which I don't think I need to say anything more about. But then there was another pretty damn good game that came out in 2024. It's called No Rest for the Wicked. It really is fantastic. It's an ARPG that I'm interested in, but also it's not actually Private Division's anymore. That's because Take-Two took it for themselves before they basically shunted away and sold all the Private Division stuff. That had left Private Division with 3 upcoming games. One of them, which is called Eternal Strands, is coming from a studio founded by Mike Laidlaw, who is the creative director of Dragon Age. However, it's now self-published, so we're down to 2 upcoming games for Private Division. The next one is Lord of the Rings, Tales of the Shire. It's set to launch March 25th, 2025. It's been a little divisive, I could say. And at least personally, I would say I really don't think the character art is where it needs to be. I have low expectations for that. That being said, I do wonder if there's things that we don't know. I mean, it's Weta Digital's first game, and well, suffice to say, their publisher has almost certainly been a complete shit show to work with over the last year. And one thing that really can disrupt a game and just lead to so much wasted time and useless iteration and bullshit is basically publisher bullshit, which messes devs around. It's always possible something like that happened. The other game then, the other future game is by Game Freak, the Pokemon developer. They have an interesting record when it comes to Pokemon games, and an interesting record with non-Pokemon games. I'm not super excited. Then, of course, finally, there is the completely poisoned chalice of Kerbal Space Program 2. It's a bit weird because right now it lacks a development studio. The Intercept was developing it, but they were closed by Take-Two Interactive, and a whole bunch of ex-Kerbal people are currently working on Kitten Space Agency. That's a spiritual successor game by DayZ creator Dean Hall's studio, and so far it seems to be shaping up real well. And that does mean that this is a bloody weird story, because whenever you think about, or at least I think about private equity, you think of a company swooping in, acquiring on the cheap, gutting for short-term profitability. Remember when private equity would go buy a whole bunch of restaurant chains and then sell the land that those restaurants were on? And then, they'd have to pay rent, and the long-term, fundamentals of the business would just completely go to shit. That's, I think, happened multiple times. So often when we think private equity, we think short-term corporate banditry. Through that lens, this is a really strange story because, at least as far as I'm concerned, these assets are not worth much. Making sense of all this really has been fun. Okay, so whenever Take-Two sold Private Division, what they really sold was the rights to various games, both released and unreleased. And that's why we were so in the dark about Private Division. If the company had been sold, there would have been a public ownership trail, and we really would have been able to piece stuff together. As an example, right? Take the studio Roll 7. They're the people who made Roller Drum. They were owned by Private Division, but at least as of us making this video, they're currently listed as an owned studio on Take-Two's site. And that's kind of the point here. What was traded was the deals, not really the physical entities. But there is a way in which this went down that clues us into Havali's thinking. Havali could have looked at their purchase and decided to sell each contract individually. As an example, say the publishing rights to Rollerdrome or the Kerbal Space Program IP. They could have went and tried to sell those things off to actual game publishers who know how to publish games, and that would actually be far more the normal private equity play. You find some sort of depressed asset, you strip it for value, and you make off with a quick buck. But that's not what they've done here. It's not what they've done at all. You don't just start and then staff a new company, one that is full of ex-Annapurna people, veterans in the indie game publishing space, if you weren't actually taking it seriously. You hire those people because they've got a proven track record of building. That makes me think that they're serious about this, but even with that track record, Well, there's going to be a lot of building. To give you an idea of just how dysfunctional it all got, just before this story broke, we were already investigating another Private Division story that was leaving players in the lurch. What happened is that as of December, the Private Division store and account system was closed. All like without an announcement, they just disappeared. And that meant that there were people who bought games like Kerbal Space Program 2, or maybe wanted to access like their crowdfunding files, and they were just completely locked out. Now, I don't really know who was going to the Private Division store to buy a game. I don't think that's a thing that people really do. But even if it was a tiny number of people, the principle matters there, and the way that it seemed to be such a disorganized shit show clues us into what was going on. Now, luckily for those players, by the time that we reached out, steps had been taken, but it illustrates another point, and that is the deep lack of trust. People who own Kerbal Space Program 2 and say, owned it through the Private Division system, they were absolutely screwed over. But people who bought the game in Steam were also screwed around to an absurd degree. Imagine a game being there for sale. There's a developer team listed, there's a publisher listed, but you know the publisher is basically closed and you know the developer has closed. You're almost thinking, if I buy this game, who the hell does the money go to? So the loss of trust is absolutely crazy. But what's weird is, if you're Havali and you're looking at all of these things, unless there's something amazing and unannounced that we don't know about, the thing that has obviously got the most value is the potential of Kerbal Space Program 2. But for that asset to be of any sort of positive value, well, you've got to actually fix Kerbal Space Program 2. Now, the people from The Intercept, who are the people making this game, they're all out of a job. So, number one, would those people even want back in, given how much of a disaster it was? Surely they would just want to move on with their lives. And also, if the blame is put on them, well, why would the company even want to hire them back? So if I was betting here, I think what they'll probably do is, well, they could start a studio, but they could also contract this to an established studio. That would be the cleanest of all their options, and it does actually fit the experience of the Annapurna team. But it still does mean that if you're a Kerbal Space Program 2 owner, sign up to the Kitten Space Program mailing list, because Kerbal stuff is going to take a long-ass time, certainly not in 2025. This will take ages. Though a curious thing is we do actually have comments from the original creator of Kerbal Space Program. There are two notable comments to close this off with. So here's a Reddit one from a Private Division person saying this: "The ex-Annapurna staff are good people and hopefully will be good shepherds of the IPs. Don't get too excited just yet, but we'll see." So that's not really interesting generally, but because it's an ex-Private Division person, that is kind of interesting. But also we learned that the original Kerbal Space Program creator has sent an email over to them to see if he can start a conversation, or at the very least learn what they're planning. Who knows what that conversation could turn into, but if they wanted some sort of free win or a good story, doing something with the original creator would probably be the fastest and cheapest way to at least get some good PR. On balance, this is far from the worst outcome, because normally Take-Two would just axe all of this, cut their losses, and move on. It's a goddamn rounding error compared to GTA 6. Or we'd see the private equity firm just flip him for a quick buck. Here, though, what we see is the Annapurna people, an experienced team, well, they've got jobs, and the only way to extract value from Kerbal Space Program 2 is to actually develop it, which means there's at least a little bit of hope for those players. And certainly versus 6 months ago, it means that incentives are better aligned with players. That money never really meant anything to Take-Two Interactive, whereas to this new company set up by Havali, well, it does seem that it's the main asset they can actually exploit. And on the topic of exploiting assets, well, there is of course this video to watch next.